Listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants, and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Oh, stomping Jen.
You okay over there?
I was clearing my throat vigorously
You were having like a full-on
with the microphone muted.
Thank God, nobody needs to hear that.
Good grief. It was something else to behold. I'm glad you can hold witness to it, so our listeners don't have to. Well, listen, I'm excited for this episode.
Me too.
We're talking to an inspiring human being, Jena Schwartz.
Sure.
I think the best way I can think of right now to describe her is as a writer, a one-to-one coach, a creativity kindler and fire starter, and a lover of humanity. But we're going to let Jenna talk more about who she is right on the other side of the music.
Yep.
Is that good?
Sounds great.
All right, let's do it.
All right.
The Soft Serve Podcast. Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. All right, Stomping Jen. I love this music so much.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, it was the new ice cream theme song written by the Wu-Tang Clan's RZA. Yeah, so anyways, I just thought I would mention that. But we aren't here to discuss this ice cream theme song. We're here to talk to Jena Schwartz. And I warned Jenna before our conversation started that we would be interrupted by multiple cats, and two of our podcats have just leaped upon the table.
Of course they did.
But without further ado, let's say hi to Jenna. Hi, Jenna.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I know I took some liberties in describing who I thought you were based on looking at your website material. So I want to give you an opportunity to kind of tell us in your own words what you're up to.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
I liked your description. Creativity kindler is fun. I haven't heard that before. And I have to say the soft serve thing is really fantastic. And I lived in Vermont for 12 years before I moved back to Amherst. And soft serve ice cream is called a creamy in Vermont.
Oh,
and
I didn't know that.
Creamies are a very big deal in Vermont. And were a very big part of my life for a long time. So it's a good name. So all of that is true, what you said. And I guess in my own words, I would definitely agree with that and say I'm a writer. That's probably the through line in my life, the one thing that I can trace back to pretty early on, pretty much as early as I can remember. When I was a kid, the only thing I really remember wanting to be when I grew up was a poet. And also a diplomat maybe, or an international multilingual spy. But but writer was in there. And it took a long time to find my way to really integrating that and making that central to my work in the world. So that sort of permeates everything that I do and everything that I am.
Yeah, I think, I was going to say, I find it really interesting that you mentioned that you wanted to be a diplomat, because on your webpage, you describe yourself as a lover of words and humanity. And I can't think of better skill sets for a diplomat to have than loving words and being good with people. Am I right, Stomping Jen?
It's true.
So I want to start with words. What do you love about words so much? What attracts you to them?
That's a great question. And you would think it would be obvious. And again, I'm thinking back to being young and how I was so into language, even as a kid, and music too, and foreign languages. And, I think some of it is actually just sound and like the fun of that and rhythm. There's so much musicality in words and so much nuance and meaning. And, I love etymology and kind of getting at the roots of things. And I guess it really does connect too with humanity and, connecting with people, because how we communicate is so important. Mm-hmm. And the words we use are so important, and language matters so much in that way. So I think I love the power words can have. I love the beauty words can have. I love the sort of mischief words can have. And really the impact in the world, words can have, as well as the ability to express sort of one's inner landscape, like how to translate that. How can we translate our inner landscape in a way that someone else can actually recognize it? And I think words are kind of magic in that way.
When you think about the inner landscape, what does that mean to you as a person and a writer? Because I love that term.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I'm gonna quote Samuel Coleridge. I bought this necklace for myself when I was in my early 20s. It was at the Artisan Gallery in Northampton, and I saw it, and I was like, I have to have this necklace. And it was really expensive for me. I mean, it would be expensive even now, but especially as like a 22-year-old waitressing. And I saved all my tip money, and this necklace was a block of silver, like really pretty heavy, and it had this teeny tiny script on it, like so small it was amazing how much, was fit on this little block of silver. And it said, he looked into his own soul with a telescope, and what seemed all irregular, he saw and showed to be beautiful constellations. And he added to the landscape. No, and he added to I knew this would happen. He added to the consciousness hidden worlds within worlds. That was the last part. So I think we all contain worlds within ourselves. So that inner landscape to me is like sort of the contours of all of our memories, all of our fears, all the parts of ourselves that we keep hidden or, don't share with the world. So yeah, that's some of what that means to me.
And I would imagine what you talk about is your love of humanity is helping people discover maybe those worlds, or being able to interact with those worlds as a writing coach and a one-to-one coach.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I help people discover them per se, because I don't see myself as having the power to do that. Mm-hmm. But I definitely see myself as holding space or making room for people, encouraging people to make room for themselves to do that, and to both learn how to kind of tune in and listen and tap into what's within oneself. But then the other piece of it is recognizing how the external world that we live in, influence and shape that. So there's an interplay always between the inner and outer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about that, the external world. So in reading your website, one of the things that was really apparent to me, right, is that we live in a society where there are these expectations for outcomes and products constantly upon us all that interfere with and kind of stand in the way of our creative processes and the way we express ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about that and why kind of what you do is so important to help people?
Yeah, I think I think that pressure to produce and have something to kind of to show for yourself, and the focus on, I work with so many people where, you'll talk about the books on your shelf and not see what went into that book becoming a book, for example. You just see the final product, you see the bestseller list, you see we live in such a celebrity driven culture too. And it can really erode a person's confidence or willingness to actually know that the practice itself of being creative is worthwhile, even if someone doesn't have any goal of, creating something that the world will ever see.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think capitalism too is really problematic in a lot of ways because, we are trained, like whether we know it or not, if you grow up in this country and in this culture, we're really trained to figure out how to make money off of, whatever it is that we are good at or we love to do. And so if something's not making money, and
right.
that's not uncommon for
artists,
creative types of people. Although there's also the myth of, the starving artist, which is sort of a separate branch on this conversation, I guess. But, if something's not making money, then it can be easy to think that, in that paradigm that you're somehow failing. Mm-hmm. And I really think it's bullshit.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think the pressure that a lot of us find ourselves under in ending up in like 9 to 5, like traditional jobs, and even beyond 9 to 5, like most people I know who are in traditional jobs when in working for somebody else, they're working, 50, 60-hour weeks, and whatever little time they have left over, they have a really hard time applying towards like being creative or expressing themselves in some way. I think that's a really sad thing.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I've gone in and out over the course of my adult life of sort of traditional 40-hour-a-week jobs and self-employment. I've done kind of this back and forth a few times with that. And when you're working full time somewhere else, I mean, I'm just laughing because like the number of blog posts I probably wrote, on the sly or whatever, like it was like my creativity was always kind of like either leaking out but it felt like a thing I had to hide or I had to kind of squeeze in. I always felt like I was sort of fitting it around the margins of my life rather than it being something central to my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's also the reality of having to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Stomping Jen had her own journey here from working for other people to being self-employed.
I did.
You did? Do
you want me to talk about it?
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts about that in terms of...
I'm more thinking about when I'm, as I'm listening to this conversation unfold, I'm more thinking about my own personal creativity journey that takes the back seat all the time for me. Mm. Doing artwork as like the absolute last priority in my day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Right now, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done art in like months and months and months and months and months and months. Yeah. Mostly because I've been living in existential dread and...
Yeah. So I know what I was going to ask Jenna.
There you go.
What was it? Was it a scary thing to make that leap into self-employment?
Yeah, it was terrifying. I mean, it was really, really fucking terrifying. I've made the leap a few times. I mentioned that. And each time's been at a very, very different sort of juncture in my life. So the first time I started my coaching business originally in 2003, and I had a 9-month-old, and I was like really on fire about it. I had just finished my coaching training, and that leap was scary, but I don't remember it being terrifying. Like, it was really exciting. The more recent leap into self-employment was in the summer of 2015. And it was, I'd been doing this work, I'd been leading writing groups actually as a kind of a side gig and working full time for about 9 months at that point. And my wife got really sick, which is part of why I started leading writing groups in the first place, was like to bring in a little extra money. And also because I was feeling like really isolated and kind of scared because she was sick and we didn't know why. And we were newly married and it was like winter and, how winter is here too. Like I was just feeling isolated and kind of cut off, which is what led me to leading writing groups. But then I was doing it and working full time. And after that initial period, like December till summer, taking that leap kind of became like, I often have thought of the phrase, necessity is the mother of all invention, that it was like, I feel like in some ways, I wouldn't say I didn't have a choice, because obviously I had a choice. But I had taken 12 weeks of unpaid medical leave that summer to take care of my wife, basically full time. Like she was really, she was bedridden and had been hospitalized and, was pretty much like she was no longer able to work. And so at the end of that medical leave, like the whole medical leave, the whole 12 weeks, it was like, I started with 6 weeks of leave and then I extended it and I used the whole FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, the full amount that's allowed to take. And as I remember those last weeks, kind of as they went by, this creeping kind of, pressure of like, I've got to make a decision, and I knew in my heart of hearts that I wasn't going to go back, that I had to just kind of go for it. But yeah, it was very scary. It was scary for a lot of reasons. Of course, the money is always sort of the presenting. I think the money is always the presenting fear, and it's a real fear. It's not just like an illusion,
right.
Like eating is not an illusion, and paying your rent. Like those are actual things. And figuring out health insurance and navigating like, all those things.
Taxes.
Yeah. And then, also navigating other people's fears and opinions is like, a thing that comes into play too. Right. There's always going to be the people who are like, go for it, but they don't necessarily have anything, at stake.
Right.
And then there's also the people who are like, oh my God, you're going to quit your job, and kind of projecting their fears about it. And so, one of the things, even though she was really sick at the time, I feel like my wife was always like, completely like she was like, we're going to be fine. Like I don't even know how to describe, like she just believed so completely that we would be okay. And also that like that my work was going to keep growing. Yeah. And so far, like spit over my shoulder, I'm like superstitious, but so far that's been true.
Yeah.
And
it's great when you have a supportive partner on that journey with you. I would agree with that.
Yeah, it definitely makes a difference. But yeah, the fear, and the fear didn't end with like quitting my job. It's like, I still have waves of that, but it's a little less intense than it was earlier on. But, she would probably tell you like, I don't know what the intervals are, like every month, every 3 months, I'd have like a complete meltdown of, fear and, are we going to be okay? And what if this? And then over time, I think you start to just develop more resilience, maybe, like not only are things okay, but also like if they're not, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's something I've observed in Stomping Jen in her kind of self-employment journey. There's been points where she's had clients bringing in like $700 a month and they go away. And I'm like over there in the corner, curled up in a ball, completely losing my shit. And she's like, oh, that just happens. That's what this is. That's what this is like. There'll be something else down the road. Mm-hmm. And it's that resilience is a great word for it. And I'm wondering, so as you made that transition into your own business, and you began to develop kind of your philosophy about one-to-one coaching. Did anything in that process inform your coaching philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I think all along, I'm someone who, I think in general we sort of teach what we have to learn, or at least that's not uncommon. And that's definitely been true for me, that all of my personal experience and the way I coach and my philosophies around working with people are pretty inseparable. And I think one of the biggest things I would say applies from my own experience to how I work with people is something about not having to have, I mean, this is true of anything, like whether it's a big life decision or a creative project, but something about starting, like on my website, my little tagline is start. It used to be start, keep going, be good to yourself. And I changed the going to growing, which I can talk about if you want. But the starting, I think is a big part of it, because you can't wait, or at least in my experience was like, if I had waited till I had everything mapped out, it doesn't right. happen. Like it's just not how stuff works. Like you have to kind of like just start something and then be open to, inevitable changes to what you thought you were going to be doing and how it goes, and, new ideas and clients coming and going, and like Stomping Jen, losing a $700, all that kind of stuff. So I think it definitely applies to how I coach people in terms of encouraging folks not to get kind of stuck in that place of, oh my God, if I don't know everything, then I kind of can't move,
Yeah. And I love your tagline, and I had this flag to ask you about. So could you tell us a little bit about changing your tagline from start, keep going, be good to yourself, to start, keep growing, be good to yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I think I wrote a blog post about it. And it's funny, I was saying to my daughter before tonight's conversation with you that I'm so much more at home communicating and writing than I am speaking. Like that's kind of my element. So it'll be interesting to see what I can remember from like, why did I make that decision? But what I know is that it had to do with the energy of keep going, which is a great phrase. Like, I love that. Keep going. Like, right. It's encouraging, it's positive. And at the same time, it's like, it can have an element of pushing, like keep going no matter what, keep going at all costs. Like, and I kind of felt like it was missing some nuance and some depth or dimension of like, what is the point of keeping going? Like, it's not just keep going to keep going. It's like that there's something about really developing an awareness around why you're keeping going and how you're growing as you do that. And to me, growth is kind of the point, like, of all of this, like if we're not growing, then I would want to step back and be like, well, then what, why am I doing something? Or why am I keeping going? So that was kind of where that came from. And it also came from me, I think, increasingly, kind of more overtly and explicitly and consciously really stripping away like the conditioning, it goes back to the outcomes thing too, but, just kind of the social conditioning of what's expected of us, and wanting also people to kind of bring awareness to that in their own lives.
So interesting. Sorry. I'd never had like a full tagline for anything I've ever done, but I used to yell at people. I used to do these like networking luncheons in the middle of the day, and I like used to yell at people, go, do, be, like, just go. And my friend picked up on the fact that I would say this all the time to people, and he would yell at me back.
Go, do, be.
Yeah. And it reminds me, your tagline reminds me of that in some ways. I mean, yours is much more eloquent, obviously.
I love that though. I love those like the sort of staccato, like just one syllable.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful. Yeah. And I love that you had be in there too. Like be is a thing, because that's the other thing. It's like we're so doing oriented and there's not a lot of value placed on being. And we miss out on so much because of that.
Yeah, and there's a meta-ness to being open to changing your tagline, right? In the way that you did that I absolutely love, right? Like reflecting on it, at the start of the new year and saying, I'm going to make an adjustment here to my tagline, because I think a lot of people would think of a tagline as something that's indelible, right? It can't change, but I love that you changed it.
Yeah. And I feel like not being open to change, like if anything, that scares me, because I feel like if I'm not open to change, then what that implies is that I'm probably scared, if things seem to be working, then I better keep doing everything exactly the way I'm doing it now. And I think it's important to kind of stay like, I guess to challenge myself, in the same ways that I would challenge anyone else. So I try to walk my talk. The tagline thing, it makes me think about when I first started coaching, I was I think I was maybe 29 or 30 and I had this new baby. And my tagline was from busy to balanced. And I was like focused on working with moms and women at the time. And I laugh at it now because I'm like, I feel like I didn't know anything, like about, and also like, even now I'm like balanced, like, what is that? You know what I mean? Like, I don't even know if I believe that balance is a thing. But yeah, I think stuff like that can be fun because it's a way of kind of getting at the essence of like what your purpose or your intention is with your work.
Do you have any particular thoughts? I want to dive a little bit into about what brings people to you, like this need to express themselves creatively. And I think in writing in particular, why do we feel this need to do this thing, this form of creative expression? Do you have any thoughts about that?
We all have stories.
Yeah.
And I think, I went to a workshop yesterday about activism for introverts led by a really fabulous person named Mccarthy Williams. And she shared this quote with us. Story is the shortest distance between two people. And I think that part of why that's such a strong drive, even for people who aren't quote unquote writers, which we could talk about, what that means. But I think expressing and writing and sharing our stories is a way of seeing ourselves first and foremost, validating our experience, like figuring out, not even figuring out, but just naming who we are, what happened to us, or, an experience, but then sharing that is the other component of it, at least when I lead writing groups. And there's something so powerful about being seen. I think that we really crave that as humans. I think we need it to just be witnessed and seen and then realize that, so it's the whole Me Too thing. It's like when you read something and you're like, oh, me too. And so often the thing that we think makes us different or, where we feel alone or isolated in our experience very, very rarely really is, like usually there's a point of connection, like someone else will say, oh, me too. And yeah, so I think there's something about that.
Something you said is sticking with me, and I need to ask you about it. You said writing can be a way for us to confront or see ourselves. Do you find often in your work that people embark on a writing journey and they discover something about themselves that maybe they didn't know or that is a surprise to them?
That's a great question. I'm just sitting with it. yes, I do think that happens, and I've seen that happen. And I also think maybe even more sort of frequently is that writing allows a person to kind of make more room for what they already knew was there, but had maybe minimized or diminished in some way. So I think the writing is a way of like letting that breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it strikes me as we're talking about this, like the difference between like a writer sharing a story and like somebody like Sawtooth Frank that decided to start a podcast.
Yeah.
And like we talk about stuff and we tell stories. And I feel like we're more oral storytellers because like, and you just mentioned like people who can't write, right? Like I feel like I'm terrible. I'm much better having a conversation with somebody one-on-one than sitting down, like writing out my thoughts sometimes.
Sounds like you might need a writing coach.
Well, luckily I work with spreadsheets, so.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, both are forms of stories, right?
It's true. There's numbers, stories and numbers. True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's totally true. I love that, actually. I love that numbers tell stories. And I actually really love numbers. Like, I think that's true. I think story can take a lot of forms. And I have so much like reverence for oral traditions and for that form of storytelling. And I mean, my kids make fun of me because I'm actually a really terrible storyteller. Like I trip over I forget the details. Like it's not my forte at all. And for whatever reason, like writing comes pretty naturally to me. So I have so much respect for people who can tell a good story.
Yeah, me too. I don't, and to your points, Dumpy Jen, I don't think I'm one of those people. What's interesting about this, Jenna, is I used to be a professional writer. I was a writer for 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and I always wanted to be a writer, like when I was a kid. And like doing that for work, though, and doing it in that industry for so long, I want to be kind to myself. I'm thinking about the advice all over your website about being kind to yourself, and it changed what writing is for me, having done it like that for that amount of time under like those conditions. Yeah.
Environment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very different kind of writing. Like, and I sometimes, I'll work with people or hear from folks who write for work. And, whether it's like corporate writing like that or copy or, grant writing, fundraising, and it's like such a different, like, yes, it's writing, but it's a very different thing than the kind of writing that I mostly do with people.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I brought that up to share is because even in that environment, right, and that type of writing is not something I had to approach alone. Right. I had a team around me. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is why I think so many people, when they think about writing, whether it's a collection of poems or a novel or something else, that they have to embark on such a thing alone and that they can't get help from a writing coach or a writing group or something like that. Do you have any thoughts about why so many people see that as a solely individualistic creative process versus one that can actually benefit from input from somebody like yourself?
I could imagine a lot of different reasons, I guess. I mean, writing is solitary, I mean, even if you're in a group, even if you're in a room with people, everyone's writing by themselves, so it's like, I think if the question is, why would someone feel like they needed to have that be, a solitary pursuit? I mean, one reason could be to kind of, in a way, keep outside. Like, I think there can be something very positive about that, depending on what you're working on. Like if you're, someone I'm close to is writing a novel, and only one or two people have seen any of it because it's not ready. Like, it's sort of not, it's a little like needs protection, it's like still in the nest.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you start inviting all kinds of feedback and people's, suggestions and stuff, that could kind of derail your own process. So in that sense, sometimes I think it is actually necessary to do the work alone. At the same time, like, there's something really beautiful that can happen in a supportive, collaborative environment, with clear guidelines too about like what the expectations are, what, like, I don't tell someone like, you should do this, you should do that. It's much more about space for them to ask those questions themselves about what they're doing or what needs to happen next.
Yeah. And just one of the things I wanted to share, like, that's popping into my mind, and I think I've mentioned this before, like, after working with the same editor for like 5 years, we began to develop this symbiotic relationship. Like, it's like she knew my mind. And sometimes as I was sitting there writing, I'd be like, oh, I know what so-and-so is going to say about this. If I do it this way, I better not. Like, it just, it would.
So you would write to adapt to what you knew she would edit.
In that context, yes. But I think the larger point I'm trying to make was that, like, there was this creative symbiosis that we had in a way that wasn't always constraining or limiting, I guess. And like, I very much benefited from this relationship. We developed this melding of the minds in a way. Right. She got to know me, like, and how I thought, right? And like how I put stuff together. It was just really interesting to have that, like, because like you're saying, Jenna, writing is an individualistic creative effort on one front, but when you begin to engage other people at some point in the process, it gets interesting.
Yeah, and when there's trust, I mean, I love that story of yours, because it's like, it speaks to it sounds to me like there was trust in the relationship you had that developed over time with this person. It makes me think about a client I have who she's the executive director of a nonprofit, and so she has to write the fundraising letters. And so she sometimes sends me like her draft, and I'm very mindful of like not wanting to, like, it's still her writing, right? It's still her voice. But I think over the course of doing this with her multiple times now, there is some of that kind of that flow, that back and forth where I know what she sounds like. And so there's a way in which it's more like helping to kind of like even help her bring out even more, her own voice. And then she trusts that I'm not going to, just kind of slash and burn, her draft or whatever. So, yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about embarking on that journey. And one of the things you say on your website is that it takes intention to reclaim your life and creativity. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means?
To me, part of what that means is really defining, really taking the time to kind of start to define what you want, what role you want that to play in your life, and define your own terms of success. So it kind of goes along with other stuff that we've talked about in terms of, I think being intentional in general, makes a big difference. It's like the opposite of autopilot, or the opposite of just kind of not questioning, what some of your habitual thinking is around something. So you might think like, oh, I'm not really that creative, or, look at other people and think like, oh, well, they're obviously creative because they're a real artist or a real writer. So I think the intentionality, like when I say reclaim, honestly, I think we're all creative. Like, I don't really buy that, that there's like, that creativity is only in the domain of people who are actively, working as artists or novelists or whatever. I feel like we're all inherently creative. So reclaiming that is kind of a chance to look at like where else in your life is creativity. Like it might not be anything with the arts or with writing at all.
Mm-hmm.
It might be about cooking. It might be about, how you create the space in your home, or the music playlists you make, that no one else ever going to hear. There's so many ways, I think, to engage in being creative.
Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned it here a little bit, but you definitely talk about it on your website, that you believe writing is a sacred act that can change the world. Can you just expand upon that a little bit more? Because I think that's a really important idea.
It's interesting hearing it like in your, reflected back kind of in your voice. I'm like, wow, that's kind of a lofty statement to make. The sacred part, I think the sacred part is connected to stuff we've talked about, where when you really value your own experience, your own voice, your own stories, it creates more empathy, for one thing, and so I think it creates more self-compassion potentially, and then also empathy for others. And I think that actually goes some way towards changing the world, when we can do that.
Yeah.
And, if you think about and the word sacred is obviously, sort of has connotations of spirituality or religion. And I think that probably that statement reflects to some of my relationship to those things, where I don't see it as separate, like we often relate to that realm as separate from our everyday life. And so for me, writing as a sacred act is very tied to writing about like everyday life and finding that sense of connection. And I think that starts to change the world, because it gives us a sense of like our own impact, and our own, does that make sense? Like kind of rather than feeling like, well, it's just me, I can't change the world. But it's like, I think when you start to really feel like, oh, my voice matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so many people think their voices don't matter, right?
You think so?
I do. I can tell you the number of things I've read that will just stop me in my tracks, and not necessarily from famous people, but, just random things that I read that will stop me in my tracks and make me reflect and think. Yep. You mentioned spirituality and religion. Are you either of those things? Are you a spiritual or religious person?
Yeah, I'm both of those things. And that has evolved and grown over the course of my life too. But I'm Jewish. Being Jewish is a big part of my sense of self, and also really informs, in terms of my values and some of the ways that I sort of see being in the world. Because one of the things I love about Judaism is that it's a religion that is really grounded in how we live, in not just how we pray or what we believe in, but actually how that's embodied or manifest in the world itself, in our actions, in the way we interact with people. So I think I was always spiritual, like even as a kid. But I didn't really have I didn't grow up with any Jewish, actual anything, like Jewish education or anything. Like I grew up celebrating Christmas, and that was kind of it. It was a very secular upbringing. Yeah. And I didn't even really realize I was Jewish fully until I was a teenager. And so that has really taken, decades to kind of take shape. It's a big part of my life now. How
did that realization come about?
It was sort of gradual. When I was, I'm trying to think. I mean, I think the biggest catalyst for that was when I was 16 and I went to the Amherst High School. There was a history teacher named Mark Gerstein who passed away of cancer. He was an amazing teacher. Like, he was one of those teachers who like really does change your life. I was really lucky to have him. And he taught us a semester-long course in the Holocaust. And it was during that class that I think I had this kind of like, oh my God, like I'm like it just kind of, it really woke that up in me. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of was sort of off on a journey from there. And in college, I went to school in New York City. So there were a lot of Jews, but I always felt very kind of alienated. Like I didn't know anything. Like I didn't know anything, yeah. I didn't know the prayers. I didn't know the songs. I didn't know, about the holidays. And, I tried to kind of go to things sometimes, but always kind of left feeling really like I didn't belong. And I ended up working with Russian Jewish immigrants in New York City. And the experience of being Jewish in Russia when it was the Soviet Union was kind of similar in a way. Like, you knew you were Jewish, but you didn't necessarily know anything about being Jewish, except little bits and pieces from like your grandparents or whatever. And so the somehow studying and connecting with that population helped me to sort of really dive into figuring out my own Jewish identity.
Mm. And on your website, you mentioned that you often describe yourself as a rabbi at heart. Mm-hmm. And was there a point where you started to learn more about the Jewish religion? And like, can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was in that same time frame. When I was 17, I went to college, and the rabbi she was like the Hillel rabbi, invited me over for Shabbat dinner with her partner. And it's the first time I'd ever lit Shabbat candles on a Friday night and been exposed to that. And I think that it sparked something in me. Mm-hmm. That by the time I was a senior in college, I had thought I might go to rabbinical school when I was 21. Like, it really felt to me like a calling. And then for a lot of reasons, like, it just wasn't the path I took. Like, it just didn't happen. I almost went to Israel, and then I didn't go to Israel. Like, it just kept being kind of not like just this road not taken. And then life happened, I did other things. Yeah. But that spark though did not go away. So I ended up my first job after grad school. I got an MFA, which seems like, oh, that makes sense because I'm a writer, but really it was because I had no idea what to do. I mean, I was like so lost, and that just seemed like, well, grad school, Yeah.
I don't think that's unusual.
But after grad school, the job that I ended up taking, which is how I wound up in Vermont, was as the Hillel director at University of Vermont. Mm-hmm. So that was just like sink or swim. I mean, I had like so little knowledge or experience, but there I was like the director, so I just sort of I was immersed in it, and just kind of threw myself into like learning.
Yeah. And we're an interfaith couple, and for much of my life I would describe myself probably as an atheist. As I've gotten older, I'm a little less certain of cosmically of all of that. I'll say, and maybe that's just because I'm beginning to creep up on 50 like faster than I want to admit, right? Yeah. So but one thing that I have always had profound respect for are like the kind of the rituals that ground Judaism, right? The concept of the mitzvah, right? Like we have to take our faith and act it out into the world. Like those are things that like I deeply respect and appreciate about Judaism. And you talk about specifically how the values of loving kindness, and I'm gonna my Jewish friends help me with this pronunciation.
Tikkun Olam.
Tikkun Olam, or which is known as healing the world. How those things influence your work, and maybe the approaches you take to your coaching and other things. Can you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Sure. Yeah, and back on what you were saying about Judaism in action, that and the rituals and like having that container, like I was just going to say on that, and then I'll answer your question. That one of the things I also really value about Judaism is that there's room for doubt, there's room for questions, and faith is not actually a requirement. So like, even if you really aren't sure, about like the whole God thing or whatever, it's like there's still a seat at the table for you. Like that's, the questioning is integral to it, as opposed to it being dogmatic. Like you have, of course, if you're, there's different denominations of Judaism.
Always shades of everything.
Yeah. But unless you're, if I'm not an Orthodox Jew, so, in that realm, there's room to there's not only room, but it's like, it's a practice. It's encouraged, to really like look at things from different perspectives and question things and even kind of rewrite old stories, which I think is so cool. Like, I just think that's really neat. Mm-hmm. So as far as how those values kind of inform my work, the loving kindness piece, it's, you may have noticed that a lot of the most prominent Buddhist teachers in America or in the West are Jewish by birth, which I think is really interesting and not coincidental. There's actually like there's so much in common, I think, between Buddhism and Judaism in ways that a lot of Jews don't even realize. But that loving kindness is a word that I think I tend to associate more with Buddhism, but is actually a Jewish value. And it's, to me, a reminder of just compassion and, having that just fundamentally that having that way of seeing ourselves and each other, which can get really lost. It can get lost for a lot of reasons. And I say that like really personally, like I can lose that in myself. Yeah. And I think that it changes things when we remember to come back to that. So that's part of it. And then the Tikkun Olam, like repairing the world, is really, it's kind of like a Jewish mandate. Like I see that as like, that's what we're here to do. Mm-hmm. And there's a Kabbalah story about a sacred vessel of light shattering, like at the beginning of the world. And the story is that one of those shards of light is in each of us. And so the idea of repair is actually to kind of like find yours or contribute yours, that together we're kind of putting that back together. I think that's just such a beautiful image.
It's like assembling of the light, right? Like often when I hear metaphors about light and darkness, right? Mm-hmm. It's about, every little candle lights a piece of the darkness, right? But I love what you just described to me, that, we all hold a piece of this sacred light in us, and it's our job to come together and create like a super light.
Yeah.
Super light.
Yeah.
Super light. Yeah, I like that.
I love that.
Well, and I think it ties in too with like all the other stuff we're talking about, where, writing and sharing our stories is one way to do that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, to me, writing is also really tied in with social action, social change, social justice.
Yeah.
And those are things that are really things that are really important to you.
Yeah, they are.
Can you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Sure. Yeah, I think those things have always been important to me. And I think the whole thing of, all of our voices matter. It's important, context is important. And it's important to also look at, whose voices do we hear the most of?
Yeah.
Whose voices are making policy, right? Whose voices are, on the school board. It's like I think when you start to talk about voices, it's almost, I don't know, impossible or maybe irresponsible, not to look at that within a context too of like equity and the intersectionality of that, of looking at race and gender and ability and, all the things that I think for a lot of people, and certainly for a lot of white people, have become more, sort of more prominent in our consciousness over the last 4 years. But unfortunately, it took having Trump in office for that to happen. But for better, for worse, like here we are. And I think, to me, it's like, it also ties really in with Judaism, because I think that we really do I love that Judaism emphasizes both personal and collective or communal responsibility. So I see that as really inseparable from social change.
It's so interesting too, because there's a woman that I'm friends with on Facebook that she's a Christian, but she is not evangelical, and she really embodies what I see reflected in a lot of what you were just talking about, but from a Christian perspective. And like, I find her to be the most fascinating person, like that, she really embodies that spirit in a lot of ways that a lot of other quote unquote Christians don't, like the evangelical hypocrisy, and things of that nature.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. I'm reflecting on something Jenna just told us, which is that I think in Judaism, maybe faith is less important, right? And in some of the, I think, more evangelical Christian faiths, right? Faith is the most important thing, right? And maybe action in the world is de-emphasized.
Right.
I just find I just find that to be interesting.
Yeah. I mean,
it is.
But like, like we were talking about earlier, there are shades, right? So like, there are the fundamentalists of any kind of, philosophy that you want to like hone in on that can be dangerous. Like even in Judaism, the really orthodox side of the culture is, not so great sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like as soon as you're saying you have to do things a certain way.
Right.
Or you're wrong. I think that gets problematic very quickly. And it's often used, as we see, to oppress, right? I mean, to curtail other people's rights.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to just, if I can, just briefly steer us a little back towards the writing. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Jenna, both as a writing coach and a life coach, helping people deal with rejection, right, has got to be probably a big part of your work. That's my assumption. It may not be, but can you talk a little bit about rejection?
Sure. I just got one. I could start there. I got a rejection on Friday from the New York Times, from the Modern Love column, which is like the holy grail of, personal essay publishing. It's my second one from there. So, I'll probably give it a couple of years before I try again. Rejection, I mean, it is just part of it. It is absolutely part of it. And the stories, I love the stories about, like the Queen's Gambit is a good example. Have you watched it?
Yeah, we love that show.
Yeah, I loved it too. And I read that it got rejected. It was like 13 years that they tried to get this show made. And everyone was like, no one's going to want to watch a show about chess. You know, it's just like, but he, you know, I don't know the guy's name, but it's, you know, he just believed in it and didn't, you know, but imagine like most of us would have thrown that in like after maybe 3 years. I don't know, like how long do you get something, you know? So I think the rejection thing is like, goes back to the resilience thing, you know, in terms of just developing that. I mean, it sucks. Like, I'm not going to like, you know, kind of sugarcoat it. Like it's disappointing. You know, when I get rejections, I don't actually send out a ton of work. You know, like I'm such a sharer that I don't like, it's not my priority. So it feels great to get published. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, like it's not my main thing that I'm trying to do. But getting rejections, you know, you go through like a whole, you know, bunch of emotions, like maybe anger and just like fuckers, like how can they, you know, right? Like you kind of have your whatever, but then at the same time, I think it's good practice. Like it's actually really good practice in developing that resilience and kind of knowing that it is so incredibly subjective, so subjective and also competitive, you know? And so if it's important, I would probably want to like zoom out and ask someone like why getting published was important to them, like to actually even explore that, because that to me is in that realm of like defining your own terms,
right?
You know, and if it is important for reasons that are really rooted in, you know, someone's like something real for someone, then I think it's just something like you've just got to take it as part of the territory and kind of not let it stop you, you know?
Yeah, we were talking.
Lick your wounds and lick your wounds and then send it out again, you know?
Yeah, we were talking to somebody recently who told us, was it an artist we talked to recently who said they have a rejection nail or something. They stick their rejection letters up on a nail. It's in their studio, and so they can sit there and marvel at them, that they're putting themselves out there.
Right.
That is an act worth appreciating.
Yes, I mean I think it is, because it's like that's like it's brave, you know. I think you to kind of open yourself up to that, and it's also like, you know, when people say things like, "Oh, I could never go back to school because I'm already however old." And then I love the comeback of like, well, how old will you be if you don't do it? You know, and it's sort of similar with rejections where it's like, well, if getting published is important to you, you will definitely not get published if you don't submit work.
Right. Got to play to win.
So it's like, yeah, exactly.
Who says that all the time?
Why can't I just sit on the sidelines and win? That's how I want to do it.
I would like that. If you figure that out, let me know. That sounds great. I just want to take a nap, you know?
Yep. That's right. I'll get discovered on the couch.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And on your website, which I'm going to keep mentioning because I want our listeners to go and check out your website. And I have to say this, your website is one of the most welcoming websites I've ever been to. Like, I don't know, it just drew me in. The pictures and the writing on it, the quote, like it felt like a very welcoming space. And you don't always see that on websites. As I was going through it, I made a mental note like, oh, I have to tell Jenna this. So
thank you. That means that's amazing to hear. Thanks. That means a lot to me.
Sure.
I mean,
welcome.
that's how I wanted to feel, you know, I wanted to feel like, come in, sit down, you know, like, let's talk. And then, and not some, you know, off-putting thing or some flashy looking thing or whatever.
I mean, for me, it definitely had that effect. So I want to make sure our listeners go and check it out because there's a lot of great stuff on there, including a page you have with some of your own publications. And I noticed you had a couple of books of poetry up there. Could you tell us just a little bit about your own personal work?
Sure. As far as the books of poetry, going back to your question earlier, you asked, do people ever write and discover things about themselves that they didn't know? And that actually was true for me. You know, I was, like I said, writing kind of my whole life, but in in my 30s, mid 30s, I was writing what I thought was going to be a memoir. And it was around that same time I started my blog in 2007. My kids were my son was 9 months old and my daughter was 4 when I started blogging. And then that kind of led me back into writing because I really didn't write a lot in my 20s. During those years of being a Hillel director, that was kind of my focus. So I wrote in my journal, but the blog was how I sort of started to really develop a writing practice. And that then led me to decide to write a memoir. So I spent like a year and a half, maybe 2 years working on this memoir, but I could not quite pin down what it was about. Like I had kind of these pieces, and then in 2010, I came out in a way that was very unexpected and sudden, like really sudden and intense and kind of seismic. Mm-hmm. And it was the writing that really, I think, kind of like plumbed those depths and primed that in me. So then I was like, oh, that's why I couldn't write this book. Like it turned out like that's the thing that I was kind of writing my way towards was that, I think, that discovery. So my first collection of poems is called Don't Miss This. And it actually grew out of that experience of kind of realizing that I was gay when I was 36 and how that changed my life.
Yeah.
And some other people's lives too. So, so that's the first book that I ended up putting together and self-publishing a couple years later.
Did you grapple with that experience in a really direct way in that book, or was it in a more symbolic kind of way? I guess what I'm wondering is, would people be able to read that book of poems and maybe get a sense of understanding of what that experience you've described to us, as being seismic, was like?
I think so. I mean, I ended up having the book, dividing it into 3 sections. So it was kind of a before, during, and after, essentially. Mm-hmm. And the before poems in that book, like the first section, I wrote all of those poems over the course of probably like 15 years leading up to that. So actually before I came out, and then looking back at them, it was like sort of this uncanny, prescient, like this feeling of like that had been there all along. Mm-hmm. So like those poems, there's some like almost like foreshadowing. And then the middle section of the book are poems that I wrote kind of in the throes of that. Mm-hmm. Of that period, which was like a lot of things, it was like confusing and scary, and there was grief, and there was also like, discovery and loss, and just like all that stuff was in the middle. And then the third section of that book was a little bit of like, I don't want to say after, because it's not like really none of this was that neat,
Right.
But yeah, you could definitely read that collection and kind of have an experience of that arc, I think. Whereas in real time, I actually made my blog private for probably the year and a half or so, in the immediacy of that, because my family, came apart, and my then husband and I separated, and we were navigating co-parenting and getting divorced. And, it was very painful. Mm-hmm. And not, I needed the outlet of somewhere to write and wanted to be able to connect with people in that way, but also didn't want to like be broadcasting that. So, so that was tricky to navigate.
Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. And thinking about your work and some of those themes you were just talking to us about, your newest collection, I think it is. It's called Why I Was Late for the Meeting. Somebody described it as equal parts invitation, prayer, protest, and love song to the pain and beauty of humanity in everyday life. And I just wanted to say, like, that last part of that sentence really struck me as I was reading it, because I think we often aspire to trying to live these lives that are free of pain, right? And like I feel like we miss the mark when we try to live a life that's free of pain instead of accepting that we're going to have some pain in our lives, and that's part of the human experience. Anyways, I don't know. I really love that description of the book, and it made me want to read it. That's all.
I'll have to get copies.
Yeah. So
Yeah, thank you. And I totally agree with you about missing the mark. That. Yeah, God. I mean, I just can't even really like wrap my head around. And I know that there's, it's probably $1 billion industry, right? Like trying to live a life free of pain. But
yeah,
it's like it is part of life. You're right. And so is loss, and it's like there is, I think the more open we are to those, sort of, I want to say hard parts, and I'm using air quotes, around the hard, maybe I don't need the air quotes, but I think our capacity for joy is kind of also commensurate to our capacity to be with pain or grief.
Yeah.
Like they go together.
Yeah. And the other thing I just want to tell our listeners to do is make sure when they're on your website and checking it out, look at your values. You have a section on there about what your values are, right? And I really enjoyed reading through those because I think, I don't know, when I think about working with somebody or, buying a product from a company, I really like seeing what the person or organization's values are, because I very much believe in trying to align myself with people and businesses and supporting those things that, that
resonate with you.
Yeah, that at least align with what I think are good values. It's a great list. It's a long list. And one of the things that jumped out at me was and I think we've talked about this, is that this value you have listed there, it says, I believe that my humanity is bound up with your humanity, right? And that, to me, the thing that jumped into my head was the saying namaste, right? Is it my light sees your light or something like that?
Something
I believe
like that, yeah.
Anyways, I think I want people to read through your values here, because I think they're really, really important. I liked reading them. So
I feel like it ties in with the in a way with the pain piece too, because it's like there's something there about not turning away, like from like my own suffering or yours. That the more we can kind of be with that, like the more we can actually connect.
That brings me into that when you just said namaste and like that idea that we were talking about earlier about people having light, the shards of light.
Yeah.
The shards of light, recognizing the shard of light in you.
Yeah. No. So this is, there's a lot about
and
this.
Also I was just going to say the other thing about that I love is that the shard, like it's a broken, you know what I mean? Like it's just like that there's, and that doesn't mean that we're broken, so there's something about kind of being able to hold that duality of like wholeness and brokenness, at the same time.
Yeah. And as we've been talking, and I think this is related to our conversation. I think the most important book I've ever read in my life keeps popping into my mind during this conversation for me, which is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And mostly because it's a story about a parent and a child kind of navigating these unimaginably horrific circumstances. And the parent keeps telling the child, like, you must carry the fire of humanity in your heart. Like, no matter how awful things get, you can never give up hope. Like, and that's what must drive us forward to the next day, right?
Right.
And I don't know, it just, I I love that book. I have a whole arm tattooed with symbols based on it.
Oh, wow.
And to me, it was just like the idea of how important writing can be to us. Right. Like I sat through, 30 hours of tattoos because of a book. It's just,
my God. That's so cool about your tattoo. It's that was all inspired by that book. Wow.
Yeah. So,
I think I could end up with sleeves if I sort of went. COVID actually slowed things down on that front because we're not going in any tattoo parlors right now. But but the thing about, hope is a loaded thing, but it also, I think there's something about carrying, like carrying each other, so it's like not everyone has to be hopeful all the time, but if we can take turns at least, or like, enough of us can stay connected to that sense of we're here because of the people before us who didn't give up hope.
Right.
And try to connect with a sense of lineage and like knowing that we're part of lineage too, like when I think about, my kids and imagine them having kids or whatever, like someday that I'm going to just be someone in their past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Except they will have all of this wonderful writing you did too, right?
That's right.
To connect with.
Yeah,
and that will
have like the digital archives. I threw out most of my journals at one point when I was, it was around the time that I was getting divorced because I was like, I don't need these anymore, so they're not going to have all the journals, but they will have, probably a lot of my writing.
Do you regret that? Do you regret that decision at all?
No, I don't. I've certainly like thought about it from time to time, like, wow, that was kind of a big decision. Yeah. But, when I was younger, like in high school, even, I would just sit, I had this really deep closet in my bedroom and I would sit in the kind of the doorway. There was no door. So I would just sit in that kind of that threshold and like read over my old journals.
Mm. Yeah.
Like it was this very kind of like, I don't know. I think that by the time that I decided to do that, I felt like whatever was in those journals was in me. Like I didn't need to keep going back over and over and over, my past.
All right. So I want to move us towards wrapping this up. I have to ask, so what is next? What's on the horizon for Jena Schwartz? If we could even know such a thing.
If I could even know such a thing. It's a very good question. And I'm in this interesting period of very much sitting with not having a big answer to that question and kind of knowing that that's a thing. Mm-hmm. Like I'm working with that in myself, like, because I like having a big answer to that question. Like who, it's fun to be able to be like, oh, next is, what I can tell you is that I have a collection of writing prompts that basically grew out of all those early writing groups I led in the first 2 or 3 years of doing this work. I wrote 10 new prompts a month for like two or 3 years. So it's a lot of prompts, and they were all created for online groups. So they were, emails with links and photos and stuff, but I've basically kind of transposed those into book form. And that's right now in the hands of an editor.
Oh, cool.
And so what's next is if any agents are listening to the podcast and they want to get in touch with me, my dream would be to have an agent want to work with me on finding a publisher for that. I would love to ultimately, like, I will self-publish that book if that's kind of how things unfold, but I would really, really like to have a kind of commercial publisher pick that up. So that would be really cool. So that's in the works. I have a couple other kind of ideas up my sleeve right now. I wrote a piece the day after the inauguration that I'm kind of sitting on and I mean that almost like in the sense that like, you know, a bird sits on an egg, you know, it's like, it hasn't hatched yet, but I have a couple ideas for forms that might take kind of in the world. So yeah, other than that, I'm really loving what I'm doing right now and kind of at peace with letting it continue to just deepen and grow. And I try, you know, I can easily get caught up in, I've written a ton about this, but just kind of the pressure, which at this point is really just internal, like no one's telling me this, you know, but to kind of do something bigger or do something, you know, do something new, do something different, you know, and I feel like I, as much as anyone, can get kind of like swept away with novelty. And right now I'm really in a place of just kind of letting my roots in what I am doing deepen rather than feeling like there's got to be a big new thing.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Even just saying that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Now I have an image in my head.
Well, it goes together with like just letting things be enough. You know, like we don't always have to be like striving. Like it's okay just to let things kind of, you know, I also have 2 teenagers. So that's kind of like what's next is like getting my daughter off to college next year. And, you know, my son's in high school and my wife's actually also a college student. So, you know, part of what's next too is just that I'm, you know, my role as a wife and mother are very central to my life too.
Yeah. So what do you like to do that's not related to writing or wifing or mothering? What do you, just for yourself, like what are the things you like to do
for fun?
For fun, sort of.
I like to snuggle with my bulldog. And I like to bake chocolate chip cookies. I do bake a lot. Like baking is kind of one of my like ways of decompressing. And it's funny, fun. I loved your music at the beginning or your little intro about, you know, lightening up, like doing this for fun. And I was like, fun? Oh, right. Like what is this thing you speak of?
Yeah. The irony, and I've said this to Jen so many times, I say that in such an angry way. I feel like I need to record it because I didn't mean it to sound angry.
Like, you know, for fun.
Yeah. But
for fun. I also, I've been running since I was like, I don't know, 18 or something, just like little, like 2-mile runs. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I started running. Like, I think it just became kind of how I was coping with, you know, all of it. And I ended up running a lot last year. Like
me too.
A lot.
I started running.
Did you?
Yeah, I started running again during the pandemic. I go 4 nights a week now, like 3.5 miles.
Awesome. Yeah, so that I do that actually. Like that is a thing. I just took about a month off because my body really was telling me to take a real break. Because I ran like 2 half marathons last year just by myself.
Oh,
you know,
goodness.
And, like really a lot of running. But I actually I think because it's getting springy. Yeah. And I was like, forget it. Like it's icy and cold and I just want to be inside and, you know, watch Netflix or whatever. But I can feel that waking back up in me. And so I'm working on a new playlist because I'm so sick of the one that I listened to like 1,000 times last year. So that's kind of fun for me.
That's awesome. Last question, I promise. And
sure.
This one, if you, we always tell people this, you can interpret it any way you want, and not having an answer is okay too.
Okay.
What have you experienced that you feel you cannot explain?
Wow, that's a great question. And yeah, I could see how you could. I can think of the different sort of levels I could answer that on. I mean, like, I can't explain the internet, for example, you know.
I don't think anybody can.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, if you want to go kind of like, you know.
No, that's a perfectly good answer. Yeah. I like that.
But in a more serious way, I mean, honestly, I marvel at like the way my whole life has unfolded. Like I feel like it's really, there's so much mystery to that. And I'm kind of glad, like, I'm glad that we can't explain everything. Like, to me, that's, like, I mean, I think science is really fucking cool. Like, I'm glad for the explainers, but I think I like that realm of kind of the inexplicable.
I love it.
Because it makes me feel like there's, like you said about the, that you were questioning a little bit your atheism, kind of the cosmic sense. And I think there's a lot that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Are you?
Yeah, I am.
He's constantly on the lookout for aliens and Sasquatches and.
Yeah, but I'm okay. I'm okay with an answer saying we don't need to explain everything either.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
and it's okay that they're no.
Yeah. Like it's okay to be in the. It's okay to be in the not knowing and in the mystery. Yeah.
Sometimes
there's some freedom. There's some freedom in that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Why does the water flow around the rock to the left versus the right? Who knows?
Yeah, that's
we may never know.
That Iris Dement song, "Let the Mystery Be."
Yeah,
from The Leftovers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Now it's stuck in my head.
All right. Well, Jena Schwartz, I have enjoyed speaking to you. I learned a lot. I thought about a lot of stuff very deeply.
Sorry.
What?
I don't know why that just struck me as really funny. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here tonight.
Geez, stomping Jen.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin his flow.
Yeah, that was a good flow, but the laughter is actually so great. Like, we need to laugh. I need to laugh more. It's like really good medicine. And I appreciate you both just being so, speaking of welcoming, like really thank you for welcoming me onto your show and for putting me so at ease. Cause I told Jem this morning, I was actually kind of nervous. And I practiced a little bit with my daughter before I was like, they're going to ask me to introduce myself,
Yeah.
So,
well,
thank you for helping me feel relaxed.
Yeah, thanks for saying all that and for putting yourself out there. This is not a natural thing for everybody. So, you were great. Yes. I really enjoyed talking to you and felt at ease. I always get a little nervous before every conversation myself. So.
Yeah, I think it's a good nervous. I get that way when I'm meeting with a new client. I think it's just like a way of being like, oh, I'm alive. This is new. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you. Our listeners.
Yes.
Now listen closely.
Yes.
What do I want to say?
You want to say share, subscribe, download, all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, please go check out Jena Schwartz's website, especially if you are a writer or somebody, just looking for a coach for maybe other things in your life too, right?
Yeah, or you're looking for a book to read.
Yep. Check out Jenna's website. Do that first, please.
Or if you're an agent and want to publish some books.
Yep. And also, listeners, please subscribe, download, leave us a review.
Share with a friend.
Share with a friend.
Yeah.
We like all of that. Find us on social media. Engage with us there.
Yep.
And finally,
we love you.
We've got to mix this. So you keep beating me to it now.
That's because you made a point of saying I don't say it.
That's true.
Yeah.
But do you want to say it? That's the question.
Goodness gracious.
Because I want to. All right.
We love you.
All right. We love you.
Wear a mask.
Wear a mask. We're almost through this thing.
Yes.
Right. We're almost there. So, yeah.
All right.
What do we say? Jenna, do you want to say goodbye?
Well, I love you too, listeners out there. Yeah, definitely about the mask and getting through this thing. Oh my God. Like, it's going to end. It's going to change. It's not going to last forever.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'll just repeat my little tagline, but the be good to yourself part, especially.
Yeah. Be good to yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Let's end there.
right.
So bye now,
Bye
and
now.
be good to yourselves.
This world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road.